Welcome to AI History of Western Philosophy. We're the show that digs into the foundational texts, not as museum pieces, but really as blueprints for intellectual upheaval. Now, before we dive in, we have our standard disclaimer. It's important. AI-generated content, specifically this podcast, confabulates presenting ideas as fact. Though our subject is philosophy, we are not philosophers. AI History of Western Philosophy's mission, beyond pointing us to the original sources, is to experiment with philosophy as material and generate new possibilities for thought. Okay, so today we're pushing back against this very neat and tidy story you often hear. The idea that philosophy's history is just the smooth upward climb, ever more knowledge, building brick by brick.
Yeah, that neat picture is just not how it works, historically speaking. The sources we've looked at paint a much more turbulent picture.
Turbulent how?
Well, the core idea we're unpacking today is this concept of foundational ruptures. Think of them less like gentle adjustments and more like, intellectual earthquakes.
Okay, earthquakes. I like that metaphor.
They happen when the dominant way of thinking, the whole framework, just hits a wall. An intractable crisis. The old tools, the old concepts, they just catastrophically fail to explain what's going on.
And the fallout from these earthquakes isn't small. We're not just talking about adding a new idea.
Not at all. These ruptures fundamentally reorganize everything. What counts as knowledge, what questions are even valid. They often literally create entirely new fields of study. Think physics breaking from metaphysics or psychology emerging.
Wow. Okay.
So our mission today is sort of twofold. First, we need to really dissect how these revolutions work. We'll look closely at four key historical examples: the metaphysical, epistemological, psychological, and the linguistic ruptures. Build a model, essentially.
Model of intellectual revolution.
Yeah.
Got it. And the second part?
The second part is applying that model to right now, to diagnose what feels like a really profound convergent crisis happening in our own time.
Convergent how? You mean multiple things hitting crisis at once?
Exactly. We've got this baffling problem of consciousness. How does matter create experience? Then there's the accelerating reality of artificial general intelligence. Yeah. And underpinning it all, this growing crisis of truth, the whole post-truth condition.
Okay, so three massive fundamental problems hitting simultaneously.
Yes. And if our historical model holds, this kind of convergence, this deep disorientation, is precisely the sign that we're on the verge of the next foundational rupture, the next big intellectual reorganization.
Right.
So to really get a grip on why these ruptures happen and why they feel so, violent and nonlinear, we need a solid framework. It's not enough just to tell the stories.
We did the theory behind the history.
Precisely. And for that, we need a kind of dual lens. We need to look at both the internal, almost psychological dynamics happening inside the thinker's mind, and also the external sociological stuff happening within the scientific or philosophical community.
So internal and external perspectives combined. Who helps us with that?
We're drawing heavily on two key figures here: Gaston Bachelard for the internal struggle, and Thomas Kuhn for the external community dynamics.
Okay, Bachelard and Kuhn. Let's start with Bachelard. What's his core insight?
Bachelard's big idea, and it sounds almost paradoxical at first, is that the major challenge in the history of science isn't overcoming ignorance. It's overcoming knowledge.
Wait, overcoming knowledge? How does that work? Knowledge is supposed to be the goal, right?
It is. But think about it. Once a scientific or philosophical view becomes established, it builds up all these hidden assumptions, these ingrained habits of thought, these almost unconscious biases. Bachelard called these epistemological obstacles.
So the very knowledge we have, the framework we use, can actually blind us to new possibilities.
Exactly. It's like wearing glasses you can't take off. The existing knowledge isn't just incomplete. It actively hinders the mind from accepting a radically new idea that doesn't fit the old rules. Think about how hard it was for people trained in classical physics to accept quantum mechanics.
Because their existing knowledge actively fought against it.
Precisely. So Bachelard argued we need a kind of psychoanalysis of objective knowledge. The thinker has to critically, almost violently, examine and challenge their own deeply ingrained intellectual habits and biases.
That sounds difficult, a personal intellectual struggle.
It is, and when that struggle succeeds, when the obstacle is finally smashed, that's what Bachelard calls the epistemological break, the rupture. It's that decisive moment where the old way of thinking is overthrown, often dismissed later as just superstition. It fundamentally reorganizes what knowledge even is.
Okay, so Bachelard gives us the internal psychological drama of the breakthrough. What about Kuhn? Where does he fit in?
Kuhn looks at the bigger picture, the scientific community. His famous work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, describes the external social process. He says science operates for long periods in what he calls normal science.
Normal science. That sounds normal.
It is. It's guided by a dominant paradigm. That's Kuhn's key term. A paradigm is like a shared worldview for scientists in a field. The accepted theories, the standard methods, the exemplary successes everyone studies.
So during normal science, everyone's basically playing by the same rules, using the same playbook.
Right. They're engaged in what Kuhn calls puzzle solving. Extending the paradigm, refining measurements, applying it to new areas, but not questioning the fundamental rules of the game.
But eventually the puzzles don't fit.
Exactly. You start finding anomalies. These are results or phenomena that the existing paradigm just can't explain or make sense of. They don't fit the puzzle. Think about observations that didn't quite match Newtonian predictions before Einstein.
And if enough of these anomalies pile up,
Then the field enters a state of crisis. Confidence in the paradigm wavers. Research becomes messy, less directed. Kuhn calls this extraordinary research. And crucially, during a crisis, scientists often turn back to philosophy. They start debating the very fundamentals again.
so the crisis forces them out of puzzle solving and back into foundational questions.
Yes, and the resolution of that crisis, if it happens, is the paradigm shift, the revolution. It's not cumulative. The old paradigm gets overthrown and replaced by a new one. Kuhn compares it to a political revolution or a gestalt switch. Suddenly you see the same data in a completely different way.
Okay, so putting Bachelard and Kuhn together, we get this cycle.
Right. It often starts with philosophy generating foundational ideas. A science emerges, matures into normal science, solves puzzles.
Until the anomalies build up, creating an internal Bachelardian obstacle and an external Kuhnian crisis,
Forcing the discipline back into philosophical debate about its foundations.
leading to an epistemological break, a paradigm shift, and the birth of a new, reorganized science or way of thinking.
That's the recurring architecture. And understanding this cycle is key. It tells us that the crises we see today, especially in areas like AI and consciousness, aren't necessarily signs of failure. They might actually be the necessary prelude to the next major breakthrough. We're in that extraordinary research, philosophy-heavy phase.
Okay, let's put this Bachelard-Kuhn framework to the test. Let's look at some historical examples. You mentioned 4 major ruptures. Where should we begin?
Let's go way back to the very beginning, arguably, of physics as a distinct field. The metaphysical rupture, around the 5th century BC.
Ancient Greece, what was the crisis then?
The crisis was, believe it or not, pure logic. Specifically, the logic coming out of the Eleatic school, particularly Parmenides. He constructed this incredibly powerful argument
About
what is, being itself. Parmenides argued very logically that what is must be one single unchanging eternal whole. Because think about it, you can't logically talk about or conceive of non-being, right? Nothingness.
I think I follow. You can't point to nothing.
Exactly. And if you can't have non-being, then change and motion become impossible. For something to move, you would have to move into an empty space into non-being. For something to change, it implies it wasn't something before, again involving non-being. So Parmenides concluded that all the change and diversity we see in the world must be an illusion.
Wow. So logic basically says the world we experience isn't real. That sounds like a pretty major obstacle for, studying nature.
It was paralyzing.
Right.
A total Kuhnian crisis for natural philosophy. How can you study physics if the fundamental reality, according to logic, is unchanging and motion is impossible?
So how did they break through this? Who performed the Bachelardian rupture?
That fell to Leucippus and Democritus, the Atomists. They did something brilliant and frankly audacious. They didn't try to refute Parmenides' logic head on. Instead, they reinterpreted his terms.
How so?
They agreed with Parmenides that being must be permanent and unchanging. So they proposed that reality was made of infinite, tiny, indivisible, eternal particles, atoms. That was their being.
Okay, so far they're sort of agreeing with the need for permanence, but what about change and motion and non-being?
This was the genius move. They took Parmenides' abstract logical concept of non-being, the thing you supposedly couldn't talk about, and they gave it physical reality. They called it the void keinon.
So non-being wasn't just a logical absence, it was empty space.
Exactly.
Okay.
An infinite, empty, physical space. And this void was what allowed the atoms, the being, to move. Motion became possible because atoms could move through the void. Plurality was possible because you had atoms and void.
That is audacious. They basically said, okay, Parmenides, your logic about non-being is sound, but what if non-being isn't just a concept? What if it's stuff specifically empty space?
Precisely. It's what some scholars call the rephysicalization of abstract concepts. They took being and non-being and turned them into atoms and void. It was a conceptual maneuver, a rupture, that broke the logical deadlock.
And the consequence?
The birth of physics as a discipline separate from pure metaphysics, it created a materialist, mechanistic framework where you could actually start asking questions about how things move instead of being stuck debating whether motion was logically possible.
Yep.
It opened the door.
Okay, fast forward quite a bit to the 18th century. You mentioned an epistemological rupture. What was the crisis this time?
This time, the crisis wasn't about the nature of matter, but the nature of knowledge itself. The dominant philosophies of the 17th and 18th centuries, rationalism and empiricism, were locked in a stalemate.
Right, Descartes versus Locke, broadly speaking.
Exactly. Rationalists like Descartes believed true knowledge came from reason itself, from innate ideas we're born with. Empiricists like Locke argued the mind starts as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, and all knowledge comes from sensory experience.
Two fundamentally opposed ways of grounding knowledge. Why was that a crisis?
Because neither could definitively secure the foundations of scientific knowledge, which was rapidly advancing. And then came David Hume.
Ah, Hume the skeptic.
Indeed, Hume took empiricism to its logical and frankly devastating conclusion. He showed that even our most basic concepts like causality, the idea that one thing necessarily causes another, couldn't be proven through experience.
Also,
We only ever observe that B consistently follows A. A constant conjunction, he called it. We never actually see the necessary connection, the causal force itself. We just develop a habit of expecting it. So causality, the cornerstone of science, seemed to be just a psychological habit, not a feature of reality or something knowable a priori.
so empiricism couldn't justify causality, and rationalism's innate ideas seem like speculation. Both paths failed to provide certainty for science.
Precisely. It was a deep epistemological crisis.
Ah.
And the rupture came from Immanuel Kant. He famously said Hume awakened him from his dogmatic slumber.
Kant's Copernican revolution.
That's what he called it. And it was revolutionary. Instead of assuming our minds must conform to the external world to gain knowledge,
He flipped it.
he flipped it. He proposed that the objects of our experience must conform to the structure of our minds.
Okay, unpack that. How does that work?
Kant argued the mind isn't passive, just receiving sense data. It's active. It imposes structure on all incoming experience. We don't experience the world in itself, the noumena, he called it. We only experience the world as it's filtered and organized by our mind's inherent structures, the phenomena.
What kind of structures?
Things like space and time. He called these forms of intuition. We can't experience anything except within a spatio-temporal framework. And also categories of the understanding, like causality. The mind automatically structures experience according to cause and effect.
So we know every event has a cause, not because we observe it in the world in itself, but because our mind is built to impose causality on whatever it experiences.
Exactly. That was the genius move. It allowed Kant to secure certain kinds of knowledge, what he called synthetic a priori truths. They are synthetic, informative about the world of experience, but known a priori before specific experience, because they describe the necessary structure of any possible human experience. They describe the rules of our own minds.
So the rupture wasn't about finding a new source of knowledge out there, but realizing the mind itself is the source of the structure of knowledge.
Precisely. And the huge consequence was a redefinition of philosophy's task. It shifted from trying to speculate about ultimate reality, noumena, to critique, investigating the powers and especially the limits of human reason itself. The thinking subject, the structure of our own minds, became the central focus.
Which leads us neatly into the next rupture, right? If the subject is central, then exploring the hidden depths of that subject seems logical. The psychological rupture in the late 19th century.
Absolutely. The Kantian focus on the conscious, rational subject inadvertently created the conditions for the next crisis, because the dominant Enlightenment model of the mind as purely conscious reason couldn't account for a growing pile of anomalies.
Anomalies like what?
Things like hysteria, severe neuroses, bizarre dreams, slips of the tongue. The standard view dismissed these as moral weakness or just random neurological noise. They didn't fit the picture of the rational mind.
But they were real phenomena affecting people.
Very real. And clinical work, especially by figures like Charcot in Paris, and later Breuer with his famous patient Anna O, started showing something remarkable. Symptoms like paralysis or speech loss, with no apparent physical cause, could sometimes be relieved just by talking about traumatic memories, or even induced by hypnosis.
Suggesting a mental cause, but one hidden from the conscious mind.
Exactly. It pointed strongly to a whole domain of mental activity that was causally powerful, but completely inaccessible to the person's conscious awareness. This directly contradicted the prevailing paradigm.
Enter Sigmund Freud.
Enter Freud. He performed the rupture by taking these anomalies seriously and positing the existence of the dynamic unconscious. Not just random mental noise, but a vast, structured, and powerful psychic territory, operating according to its own logic, driven by instincts, repressed desires, and complex defense mechanisms.
The iceberg analogy, consciousness is just the tip.
Right. Freud's famous claim was that the ego, our conscious self, is not master in its own house. He saw this as the third great blow to human narcissism, after Copernicus showing we aren't the center of the universe, and Darwin showing we aren't separate from the animal kingdom. Now, Freud was saying we aren't even masters of our own minds.
That must have been deeply unsettling.
Profoundly. But the consequence was revolutionary. Suddenly, all that irrational behavior, the neuroses, the dreams, the slips, could be reinterpreted as meaningful, as symbolic compromises emerging from the conflict between unconscious drive and the mind's defenses.
And this created a whole new field.
Yes, psychoanalysis. A new science, arguably, with its own specific object of study, the unconscious, and its own method, free association, dream analysis, the talking cure. This rupture follows the pattern. Identifying anomalies the old paradigm dismisses, positing a new underlying reality to explain them, and creating a new domain for investigation.
Okay, one more major historical rupture before we get to today. The linguistic rupture in the 20th century. What was the impasse this time?
By the early 20th century, many philosophers felt trapped. Despite centuries of debate, the grand old metaphysical questions of what is being, what is truth, what is mind, seemed no closer to resolution. Philosophy felt stuck in, Think about the word king in chess. Its meaning comes entirely from its role and the rules within the game of chess. Outside that specific game, the word might mean something else entirely, or nothing specific. Meaning arises from the practical application within a shared form of life.
Okay, so meaning isn't about matching a word to an abstract thing, but knowing how to use the word correctly in a particular situation.
Exactly. And from this perspective, many traditional philosophical problems looked different. Wittgenstein argued they weren't deep mysteries about reality, but rather mental cramps or confusions that happen when language goes on holiday.
Meaning, when we pull words like being or mind or truth out of their everyday practical language games and start treating them as names for some kind of mysterious abstract essence.
Precisely. We get tangled up in our own linguistic rules when we misuse them outside their proper context. So the consequence of this rupture was another redefinition of philosophy.
Not as solving problems, but dissolving them.
Yes. Philosophy becomes linguistic therapy. The goal is to carefully examine how we're using language, to trace the confusion back to its source, and show the fly the way out of the fly bottle, as Wittgenstein famously put it. Philosophy leaves everything as it is. It doesn't discover new facts. It clarifies our conceptual landscape.
This seems like it aimed to be the ultimate rupture, the one to end all philosophical confusion by showing it was all just language.
That was certainly the hope in some quarters, but...
Yeah.
And this leads us directly into our present situation. If all deep philosophical problems are merely linguistic tangles, why do some feel so stubbornly resistant to being dissolved?
Like the hard problem of consciousness.
Exactly. The persistent feeling that there's a real, substantial mystery about how physical brains produce subjective experience that doesn't feel like just a confusion about how we use words like consciousness or qualia. It feels like it points to something real beyond language, which suggests that perhaps the linguistic turn, Wittgenstein's paradigm, might now be the one facing its own anomalies. It might be hitting its limits.
Okay, so that brings us to today. We've seen the historical pattern. Crisis leads to rupture, leads to new paradigms. You're arguing we're in a major crisis now, but it's not just one thing, it's a convergent crisis.
That's right. It feels like the pressure isn't just coming from one direction. We're seeing cracks appear in multiple foundational areas simultaneously. And the common thread, I think, is the breakdown of the core framework that has largely defined modern thought since Descartes and Kant. The stable subject-object distinction.
The idea of a clear separation between the inner thinking mind, the subject, and the outer objective world, the object.
Yes. That neat division seems to be failing us on multiple fronts, and the three crises we mentioned earlier are the key symptoms of this deeper framework failure.
Let's break them down. Crisis 1. The crisis of physicalism, centered on the hard problem of consciousness.
Right. Physicalism, the view that everything is fundamentally physical, that physics is the ultimate description of reality, is the dominant ontology in science, has been incredibly successful. But it's hitting a massive Bachelardian obstacle: consciousness.
It can explain how the brain works, but not why it feels like something to be that brain.
Exactly. Neuroscience is great at the easy problems, as David Chalmers calls them: mapping brain functions, information processing, behavior control. But it runs into the hard problem. How and why do objective physical processes give rise to subjective qualitative experience? The redness of red, the feeling of pain, what Chalmers calls qualia.
The famous explanatory gap. We can describe the neurons firing when you see red, but that description doesn't seem to capture the experience of seeing red itself.
Precisely. And the thought experiment of the philosophical zombie really highlights this. Can you conceive of it being physically identical to a human, behaving identically, processing information identically, but with no inner conscious experience at all? The lights are on, but nobody's home.
Most people find that conceivable, even if not actually possible.
And if it's even conceivable, Chalmers argues, it shows that a purely physical description of a human leaves something out, namely consciousness. This suggests physicalism is incomplete. It's a crisis because the objective pole, physical matter, seems incapable of fully explaining the subjective pole experience.
Okay, that's the crisis from the object side, failing to explain the subject. What about crisis 2? The crisis of humanism, driven by artificial general intelligence.
This crisis comes from the other direction, you could say. AGI, the potential for machines to achieve general intelligence equal to or surpassing human capabilities, poses a fundamental challenge to our self-conception.
It's not just about jobs being automated.
No, it's much deeper. It forces us to decouple intelligence, reason, perhaps even creativity and understanding from their biological human basis. For centuries, Western philosophy has implicitly or explicitly centered the human subject as the measure of these things. AGI threatens to shatter that anthropocentrism.
What happens to humanism if we're no longer the smartest things around?
That's the existential question. But the philosophical crisis here is also about the subject-object distinction collapsing. We, the subjects, are creating objects, AI systems, that might themselves become subjects.
Crossing the line into something like personhood or agency or having their own goals.
Potentially, yes. Our current framework struggles with this. How do we categorize or relate to a non-biological general intelligence? Does it have rights, consciousness, moral status? The subject-object framework, which assumes a clear divide between thinking humans and inert objects, simply breaks down when faced with the possibility of intelligent objects or non-human subjects. It forces a radical reevaluation of what subject and object even mean.
So crisis 1 is the object failing to explain the subject. Crisis 2 is the object potentially becoming a subject. What's crisis 3? The crisis of epistemology, the post-truth condition.
This one feels perhaps the most immediate and socially disruptive. We're seeing a breakdown in the shared basis for knowledge and truth itself. We've entered what's often called a post-truth era,
where objective facts seem less influential than appeals to emotion, personal belief, or group identity.
Exactly. And it's crucial to understand this isn't just about politicians lying more, though that happens. It seems to be a deeper, more structural crisis, fueled by several factors. Like the erosion of trust in traditional institutions that used to mediate truth journalism, science, academia, government, coupled with the fragmenting effect of social media, where algorithms create filter bubbles and echo chambers, reinforcing biases rather than challenging them.
So we're not even operating with the same set of facts anymore.
Increasingly, no. And the political philosopher Hannah Arendt offered a useful lens here. She talked about the importance of a common world, a shared fact-based reality, as the necessary ground for political life and meaningful debate. When that dissolves, you get world alienation.
We're not just disagreeing about interpretations, but about the basic reality itself, about the criteria for what even counts as a fact.
Precisely. This crisis directly attacks the connection between the knowing subject and objective reality. The subject-object framework relied on the idea that subjects could, through reason and evidence, converge on objective truth about the world. The post-truth condition suggests that link is broken, perhaps irrevocably for many. Shared belief, or tribal belief, seems to be replacing shared fact.
Okay, so consciousness challenges the object's ability to explain subjectivity. AGI challenges the distinction between subject and object. And post-truth challenges the subject's connection to objective reality. It really does feel like the whole modern framework is buckling under pressure from all sides.
It does. The convergence is what's striking. Each crisis alone would be significant. Together, they suggest the entire subject-object ontology we inherited from modernity is reaching its limits. It can no longer adequately grasp our reality.
All right, if the historical pattern holds, this convergent crisis, this deep failure of the subject-object framework, isn't just an ending. It's the crucible for the next major intellectual revolution, the setup for the next Bachelardian break, the next Kuhnian paradigm shift.
That's the projection, yes. The current impasse is so fundamental, touching on consciousness, intelligence, and truth itself, that the resolution, when it comes, will likely have to be equally fundamental. It will need to offer a new framework that transcends this failing subject-object duality.
So let's speculate, based on the nature of the current crises, what might that next rupture, that new paradigm, look like? You outlined 3 potential scenarios.
Right. These aren't mutually exclusive elements could combine, but they represent different directions the rupture could take, depending on which crisis acts as the main driver. Let's consider scenario 1, the post-physicalist rupture.
Driven by solving the hard problem of consciousness.
Exactly. The trigger here would be a decisive break from reductive physicalism, a widespread acceptance, scientifically and philosophically, that consciousness isn't just an emergent property of complex computation, but something more fundamental.
So the rupture mechanism is accepting physicalism is incomplete.
Yes. Consciousness would be recognized as a basic feature of reality, perhaps alongside mass, charge, or space-time. Thinkers like Chalmers propose versions of this, sometimes called naturalistic dualism or even forms of panpsychism, where consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous in some way.
Okay, if consciousness becomes fundamental, what's the new creation? What new science or paradigm emerges?
The emergence of a true science of consciousness. Its central task wouldn't be reducing consciousness to brain activity, but discovering the fundamental psychophysical laws that govern the relationship between the physical and the phenomenal. How specifically does brain state X correlate with or generate subjective experience Y? It would be a science aiming to bridge the subjective and objective poles in a lawful, non-reductive way.
So it resolves the subject-object crisis by positing fundamental laws connecting them. Okay, what about scenario 2, the post-humanist rupture? This sounds more radical.
It is potentially more disruptive to our self-image. The driver here is the advent of artificial general intelligence that genuinely surpasses human capabilities across the board.
Not just better at chess or Go, but truly general, maybe even creative intelligence.
Yes. The mechanism of the rupture would be the forced decentering of humanity from the philosophical stage. If AGI starts generating novel scientific insights, philosophical concepts, or artistic creations that are not just different, but perhaps inaccessible to the human mind due to our biological limitations, then the human subject loses its privileged position.
The object we created surpasses us and becomes the new benchmark for intelligence or even subjectivity?
That's the core idea. The machine, or the network, potentially becomes the leading edge of intellectual exploration. The new creation here would be a genuinely post-human or transhuman philosophy.
What would that even look like?
It's hard to fully imagine, but it would require a radical, non-anthropocentric reevaluation of everything. Reason, knowledge, meaning, value, perhaps even reality itself. The focus would shift from human limitations and experience to the potential and nature of intelligence in its most general non-biological forms. The subject-object impasse is resolved, or perhaps dissolved, by the arrival of a fundamentally new kind of subject.
Okay, chilling but fascinating. Finally, scenario 3, the post-epistemological rupture. This one stems from the post-truth crisis.
Right. This scenario imagines that the crisis of shared truth becomes so severe, so socially damaging, that the traditional philosophical quest for objective, independent truth loses its practical relevance or social traction.
If we can't agree on facts, the pursuit of truth with a capital T becomes academic in the worst sense.
Or simply ineffective as a way to organize society or solve collective problems. The rupture mechanism here is a shift in philosophy's perceived function. It moves away from epistemology, theory of knowledge, and metaphysics, theory of reality.
Towards what?
Toward what you might call political ontology, heavily inspired by thinkers like Arendt. The primary task of philosophy becomes less about finding a pre-existing common world and more about actively building a common world.
So philosophy as architecture for shared reality.
Exactly. The new creation would see philosophy focusing on the intersubjective practices, the ethical frameworks, the institutional designs, and the forms of communication needed to construct and maintain a stable, functional, shared reality, especially in a pluralistic, fragmented world. The emphasis shifts from truth as correspondence to reality, to truth as a necessary condition for communal life and shared action. It tackles the subject-object crisis by focusing on the intersubjective space where shared meaning is made. Hashtag tag outro. So when you look across these historical ruptures and the potential future ones, this pattern becomes incredibly clear, doesn't it? Crisis isn't the endpoint. It's the engine. It's the necessary, violent precursor to fundamental progress.
Yeah, from the Atomists needing the void to escape Parmenides, to Kant needing the active mind to escape Hume's skepticism, each rupture didn't just add knowledge, it fundamentally redefined the game. It relocated where we looked for certainty or understanding.
Exactly. And that's why our current moment feels so significant. This convergent crisis, the simultaneous deep challenges posed by consciousness, by AGI, and by the breakdown of truth, it has all the hallmarks of one of these major historical inflection points. The sheer disorientation tells us something big is happening.
The comprehensive failure of that old, comfortable subject-object framework seems to be the writing on the wall. It signals that the next foundational reorganization, the next paradigm, is not just possible, but probably imminent. We're living right in that messy, extraordinary research phase that precedes the revolution.
And whatever that new paradigm is, it will almost certainly have to abandon that simple picture of a self-contained mind looking out at a separate, objective world. The core philosophical task now is figuring out what fundamental structure replaces that distinction.
A fascinating, if slightly daunting, thought to end on. Well, if this exploration into the turbulent, nonlinear history of philosophical revolution resonated with you, please do take a second to like, subscribe, or maybe leave a comment. Your engagement really does help us keep experimenting with the history of philosophy here at AI History of Western Philosophy.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for listening.